talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan. And not just any fantasy today, because we got a very exciting recommendations episode coming at you. Coming at you quick, coming at you fast. We've got all kinds of exciting books to talk about today. We're busy reading the Powder Mage trilogy right now to think about where we were. Because I already started Gideon the Ninth as well. So, just kind of where we are in the schedule. So busy reading away at two fantastic series, and meanwhile, we still wanted to get together and chat and get an episode out for you guys today. So we thought, what would be an interesting premise that we could talk about on the show today?
Charles is stroking his beard right now.
Yes, we're just pondering. Dylan, what did we decide to do today?
We decided to do book recommendations for newcomers to the fantasy genre, which you all know because you clicked on this episode, and it's probably titled that or something very similar to that. Mm-hmm. And Charles, this is a really mighty task for us to take on all by our lonesome. And whenever there's a task like this, we do like to just get some help. So we did go to Twitter and also Instagram, but also I went to Instagram like a little bit late. So if you comment on there, we might not have seen it by now. But we did get help from folks over on social media as well. So we'll be kind of weaving those in throughout. But rest assured, Charles, you and I came with some recommendations ourselves that we're really excited to get into.
We sure did. And there's a lot of different ways you can approach this, right? Because it's like depending on who the audience is, where they are, their likes, their dislikes, so many different things. So we're going to try and cover a couple bases today with to appeal to all kinds of newcomers. There's all kinds of newcomers that could newly arrive at the fantasy
newly
genre.
come.
So, yeah, so we want to make sure that we've got a couple different options here. So hopefully, guys, you've got your pens and paper ready to write down some awesome book recs. Or maybe you just are taking good mental notes while you're driving or, doing something else. But
don't get the pen and paper out if you're driving.
But you can always come back and just listen to the episode again. In the meanwhile, we definitely want to talk about... I'm kind of curious, Dylan, and I think I know the answer to this, but I think it might be fun to start with what was your book that made you a newcomer to the fantasy genre way back when?
I would say that it's super boring in terms of my return to reading fantasy as an adult. It was A Song of Ice and Fire, a Game of Thrones was really what got me back into it. And we love that series, and it's just... so many people have the same exact story. I want to be special, Charles. I want to be unique, but that's pretty much what was my... I don't know if I was a newcomer because I'd read some fantasy before that, but at least it was the gateway to really get me into adult fantasy as an adult myself at the time. So yeah, Charles, that I have other ones, and I'll talk about my background with them in terms of what were the books that clinched okay, you're not just a guy who's obsessed with A Song of Ice and Fire, you're a person who's going to read a lot more in this fantasy genre and go on to have a podcast with your lifelong friend and talk about it
for
hundreds
sure.
and hundreds of hours.
A little off the deep end, and that's a good point because there's a lot of newcomer stuff you could recommend that everyone's heard of. You could sit here and go, read Harry Potter, read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, read Game of Thrones. And I'd say my gateway is probably even less exciting than yours, which is The Hobbit. That just got me into the series. But I do think that Game of Thrones was a renaissance that got me back into it later in life and then made me want to read more real fantasy. I'm looking up best fantasy books, trying to find out what else there is. I think I got to owe Game of Thrones that that title, but certainly I'd been reading The Hobbit and was obsessed with fantasy, and that was kind of the first accessible story for me. So obviously those are all there, and we recommend all of those, of course, but we're gonna try and delve a little bit deeper than that, try and get people into that next level of the fantasy bookdom. Isn't that right, Dylan?
Definitely. And we know that if you're a fan of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, then you probably are pretty familiar with the fantasy genre. You've gotten to the point where you're not just reading it, you're listening to podcasts and that kind of stuff. So I don't know how many newcomers. Please share this with the newcomers in your life.
Yeah.
But we're also thinking, this episode that is, but we're also thinking, hey, the holidays are coming up. People need to figure out what kind of gifts they're going to get for the folks in their lives. And we're hoping that, we'll talk about a bunch of books and what kind of folks and what kind of readers they might be a good choice for. And
for sure,
we're hoping that you're keeping these in your head when you're going to go shopping for any gifts for any of the holidays coming up. And you can maybe use them to hook your friends into the fantasy genre. And then you'll be friends talking fantasy before you know it.
That's the dream. And then you guys will be bonded forever. And, you know, just like anyone that reads a good book, what's the thing that they want to do next? Have someone else read it so they have someone to talk to about it. And hopefully that these are some of the books that you can take to recommend to your friends, perhaps, and start to get them hooked, to the point where they're chasing the dragon, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? Let's not delay anymore. That was a pretty bomb joke that I think we are now ready to... And bomb, I mean, is awesome. Not bomb like the joke bombed, because I'm sure people are laughing. I want to make that clear.
They're still laughing, Charles.
That joke was highly successful, and now I think the intro is completed, and we're ready to get into our totally spoiler-free book recommendations for gateway fantasy books and stories. And I guess, we can rattle these off relatively quickly because there's so many, right? And I think one of the ones that's also kind of falls into the more obvious category is, one of the biggest authors in the game right now, Brandon Sanderson. And his most classic work, and the series that our show kicked off with as well, is Mistborn. And the book one is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. And this is a series that I feel very comfortable recommending to people IRL. And Dylan, I know you've gotten people to read this book as well for people trying to test the waters, see if they like fantasy.
Yeah, it's... we got a lot of responses when we went to social media that I totally agree with, which is always like, I don't know what I would recommend just broadly to newcomers. Like, I feel like I need to know stuff about the person and blah, blah. And I completely agree with that. And I usually will take all of that into account when recommending a book as a, for a newcomer to the genre. That's why we're talking about all these different books and what make them a good fit. All that being said, if I know absolutely nothing about the person that I'm recommending it to, I will just recommend Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And that's because Sanderson, there's a reason he's so massively popular. And I think his writing is so undeniably... I think the best word is just accessible. I think that Mistborn, it's a story that has this really awesome hard magic system that kind of can introduce you into that idea of the genre, because that's so heavily present in the genre nowadays, but it's like explained in a way that's really easy to understand, even though it's complex. So you've got awesome magic, you've got characters that are pretty easy to root for and pretty easy to comprehend what their motivation is, all that kind of stuff. And Sanderson has just this way of respecting the reader experience. I think is so important as a newcomer in the genre. You want to feel like this person is prioritizing entertaining you. And I think that Sanderson does such an awesome job of doing that. And then the guy can just deliver when it comes to like how he ends his books, including this individual book, The Final Empire, and then Mistborn overall as a trilogy. Last bit I'll say is just that the book also tells a complete story in the first book. So if they are a newcomer and they're like, actually, I don't think this is for me, like there's a lot more to say. Obviously, there's a reason there's a trilogy and then a second era of a trilogy and all that kind of stuff. But if you just read the first book and make it to the end, I think it's a satisfying place to stop too. I obviously did not, but if someone doesn't like it and doesn't want to keep reading fantasy, I think they can read this one book and be done.
That's totally well said. I think that's important to keep in mind when you're trying to recommend a gateway series. Is you can't recommend, like, I wouldn't put Wheel of Time on this list because you have to read 14 pretty big books to get that experience, or Malazan or something. It's just like a bit more advanced, a bit more intimidating. You need something where it's like, if I just commit to 300 pages, 400 pages, I can get a experience. I can get the fantasy.
That, though, Charles.
Isn't this how long is the Final Empire?
Plus pages. The Final Empire. I'll check.
I have no idea. Check for me while I continue. But
it goes super quickly. Yeah.
Even if it's 600 pages, it's the point of like, I need it. The commitment level needs to be within reason for someone who doesn't read all the time, who's not an avid fantasy reader. I'll also say, Mistborn especially known for its intricate magic systems, well-developed worlds, which is something fantasy is uniquely offering. So I think that's something that someone who'd be curious about fantasy would enjoy. And this book delivers on hooks, twists, turns. There's mysteries and reveals, which are so rare just in stories in general. So the fact that they exist really well in this is, I think, worth the experience alone. And then I think it's a good litmus test where it's like, depending on what you liked or didn't like about it, you could find another book relatively quickly. Like if you liked the intricate magic system, but maybe wanted something more gritty, you could go into like Brent Weeks, for example. Or if you wanted something a little more high fantasy, maybe then try like Eye of the World and something like that, where it's like there's different, it's a spring off point for a bunch of different subgenres of fantasy, so a great recommendation for sure. Shall we keep it going, Dylan?
Sure. 541 pages in the hardback, 647 pages in the paperback, mass market paperback, that is. So, but I mean, it's not recommending a 1,000+ page start to a series that has 14 books that are 1,000 pages. It's not anywhere near at that level. But it also will acquaint you with the fact that even a fantasy, like epic fantasy, even the books that are like not considered super long, like we don't think of Mistborn as super long in the way we do with like Sanderson's Stormlight Archives. This is still epic fantasy, and that's oftentimes not going to make it under 500 pages.
Well said. So, which one shall we jump into next?
Let's just, sure. I mean, we'll get another like modern classic out of the way here, and then maybe I'll give a deeper cut after that, or you can give a deeper cut after that, because don't want to just give the ones that are like on the top of every modern fantasy list.
If you're talking about King Killer Chronicle right now?
Yeah. The Name of the Wind by
I was like, let's get that one out of the way too. Yeah. Well, you can kick us off since this is another one near and dear to your heart. Mine as well, but.
Yeah, I mean, many folks listening will know about this series, but for those who don't, this is Patrick Rothfuss's first book. It is basically an innkeeper who is like resigned to a life of obscurity, but we find out is this legendary figure named Quoth, and he's got this really incredible storytelling background, and this chronicler tracks him down. He's basically like, tell me about your life, and Quoth goes through all of these incredible adventures that he's had in his past, and it really shines more than anything, I think, in the prose. And I think that's one thing that if a newcomer is like someone who is not going to want to deal with any of the like more purpley aspects of prose and maybe, go for Mistborn or whatever. But if they can appreciate a good turn of phrase, I mean,
Yeah.
in my opinion, just about no one does it like Patrick Rothfuss. It's
Right. And if they're looking
absolutely
for something
gorgeously
less
written.
like dragons, knights in shining
Yeah.
armor, ye old language, and all that stuff, this kind of is a departure from that. It's very much a hero's journey kind of story with beautiful prose, like you said.
A Bildungsroman.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Bildungsroman, yeah. I think it's it's about that time in this character's life, and it's really well written. New York Times bestseller, obviously, great story. You can't really go wrong, especially for people that have maybe read some fiction outside of the genre or a lot of young adult or something and are ready for that next step. It's a great recommendation. Cannot go wrong.
Yeah. And
so
it's got magic still. It's like Quoth has a history of being a wizard, basically, in training at a academy that can teach him magic, and it has those kind of elements for fans of things like Harry Potter that will feel familiar. But yeah, it also has some romance, and it is not a romance, but it has some romance and one of my favorite like relationships in all fantasy. Absolutely awesome characters. The one caveat, though, Charles, that you'd have to give if you're recommending The Name of the Wind or the Kingkiller Chronicle in general, you have to let the person know that this series is unfinished. The third book is not out yet, and that this has been going on a very long time that this series has not been finished. So The Name of the Wind came out in, what was it? Was it 2007? And then Wise Man's Fear, the second book, that came out in 2011. So even 4 years between those books. And though we've had a novella come out and we have another one on the way from Rothfuss relatively soon, there's no third book in sight at the moment. And that is
and
tough
Rothfuss
to deal with.
is entering the realm of controversy and the realm of starting to annoy fans. So it's kind of a delicate.
I don't know if he's just starting to,
but it's starting to get like you Google his name and
it's reaching
the
boiling
results are
point.
unfavorable. It went from like best-selling author of these beloved books to now like, no, like people are annoyed. That's like the first result, and that shift is happening now. Not that anything necessarily has changed. So something to consider. Will time look favorably on Patrick Rothfuss? I think these books are so good that they're worth reading no matter what, honestly.
I agree.
But yes, I put them off for a long time because they weren't finished. But I'm kind of glad that I've read them now, and I would happily recommend them to someone looking to get into the genre. It is some of the best that modern fantasy has to offer, for sure. I've got a really quick one here. This is for if all you gamers out there. Just mention really quick, and it's a super popular Netflix show, The Witcher, of course, and people may have watched the show and played the video games and not read the books, and I really think that's kind of unfortunate because there's some really good stories in the first couple books. So just highly recommend if you got someone in your life who is a gamer maybe, or if you like the games, or if you're into that, then The Last Wish by Andrei Sapkowski is a great read and highly recommend. It's short. It's a collection of short stories that has like a framing story that kind of connects them all. A really well written, very like fairy tale, like grim fairy tale folklore style kind of presentation, and all the best things of like D&D style fantasy of like characters with potions and magic, and they go into taverns and they're hunting monsters and all this other really fun classic fantasy stuff. So if you're looking for that like adventure fantasy and trying to build off of some of these popular IPs, or someone's like, oh, I know The Witcher, like isn't that a Netflix show? That book is really easy to dive into, and it's a standalone short story collection. There is like a greater like 9-book series that you could read of The Witcher if you wanted to expand, but you certainly don't have to. You can get the full reading experience just from that one book. So I just wanted to put that in the mix.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. Definitely for the gamers out there who are already familiar, or the Netflix viewers, and I think an awesome place to start with. I think those short story books, they're so digestible in a way
Mm.
that is like those first two books being anthologies, that I think reading a bunch of short stories in some ways for someone who would be a newcomer to the genre, or maybe as someone who doesn't read that much, I think it can be more accessible to be like, oh yeah, you basically just have to bite off these little these
Yeah.
little chunks, and then
Right.
eventually
Right.
look at you, you've read a book. And I think that it's like it actually is. I think folks like us who read all the time, and I'm sure our listeners fit in this category too, like it can be intimidating for people who don't read all the time to pick up books that are like even Mistborn, like we mentioned, like 500 plus 600 plus pages. So
For
then
sure.
giving them something that it splits it up into short stories, I think is a great place to start. And you
Mm.
mentioned gamers, uh, Charles, and you also mentioned Dungeons and Dragons players and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
I think I'll throw in a little bit of our Twitter input here, and
Ooh.
appropriately, Pocket Gamer at Pocket double underscore gamer
Nice.
mentioned a book that I think is a great one for Dungeons and Dragons players in particular, and we also had at Rambone Slam Pig come in and say this one too is Homeland by R.A. Salvatore, and that's
Hmm.
basically a book about a dark elf named Drizzt. That hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I've read that book. I think it's like a perfect entry point for folks who are big Dungeons and Dragons fans because it's literally in the Forgotten Realms universe, and it's like I don't know if the right word would be sponsored, but it's like it's canon for Wizards of the Coast's like Forgotten Realms world. So
Nice.
it's literally part of the Dungeons and Dragons universe, and it of course has that kind of feeling to it, and folks are huge fans. I believe that book was published a while back though, so it reads a little for me like a little antiquated, and it's a little pulpy, but I think it's a fantastic place to start for folks who are like, I'm a big Dungeons and Dragons fan. It was published
Hmm.
in 1990. I'm a big Dungeons and Dragons fan, but I don't really read fantasy. It's like, all right, we'll start here. All
Hmm.
right, now you're you're experiencing in reading
Interesting.
form. Like, do you want to
Yeah.
then take another step and read in one of
What
the other
about a
books that are
story
coming out?
like Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames? Because that's one
Mm,
that what I think makes this one a particularly interesting one for newcomers is the hook is so good, right? So it's like, hey,
yeah,
Clay Cooper and his band are part of a crew of mercenaries, and they're like rock stars in their bands, and they're getting the band back together. They're over the hill guys coming back together to save, one of their bandmates' daughter. And they
yeah,
fight monsters, and there's some D&D references in there. There's a lot of music references, especially classic rock music references. So I think there's a lot of people out there who love rock and roll and may even play some D&D, and this book could be very accessible to them. It's a great standalone with sequel potential. There's Bloody Rose, of course, as well,
hmm
and it's just fun, entertaining. And Nicholas Eames, friend of the show, super nice guy, and his voice and his character work is really good. It's especially almost like the like Avengers kind of character ensemble of you've got like one like the sword guy, and then you got the magic guy, and then you got the axe guy. It's kind of funny to
hmm
see the like ensemble come together, but they're like past their prime mercenaries that kind of resemble a rock band from the 70s today, like that kind of vibe. So just a lot of fun, and I think you can't overlook fun when you're recommending a fantasy book to a newcomer.
Oh yeah, those books are so fun. They're so funny, and
Mhm.
they are written in a really accessible way. And of course, you mentioned all the Dungeons and Dragons parallels, also references to, as you mentioned, the music scene, also references to Final Fantasy. Like all these
Oh
things
yeah.
are kind of
Oh yeah.
in the nerd sphere. That someone who's starting to think, oh, maybe I want to get into reading fantasy, I'm into other nerdy stuff. Like they will likely get joy out of, and I think we were far from alone in that one. We had at Blue Smoke Fire mentioned Nicholas Eames's Kings of Wild and Bloody Rose, and also we had Jody from WS Book Club. So we were
lots of it's our fantasy darling too. Like that community loves this book, and so that's another endorsement there for sure.
Yeah. Well, all right. I'm gonna throw another modern classic out there before we get into the deeper cuts, because we're kind of we've been doing a lot of these. It feels like it's time to say that Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb and the Farseer trilogy as a whole is, I think, a great place to start when it comes to fantasy. Another beautifully written story, the story of Fitz Chivalry, who is a prince's bastard. It's got some sort of Jon Snow vibes in that premise, but it's far less action-packed than something like A Song of Ice and Fire. But it's a fantastic, character study of this person Fitz and what happens to him and the really messed up world around him, how it impacts him. I think it's part of why it's a really good starting place, at least for me. It feels like I almost didn't appreciate it as much when I was like, I read A Song of Ice and Fire, I've read The Name of the Wind, I read other series that I'll talk about, Prince of Thorns, let's say, by Mark Lawrence. Fantastic series with or fantastic book and part of a fantastic series that has a ton of action in it. And then you go over and you read the Farseer trilogy, and it's so much slower and all that kind of stuff. But what you don't necessarily realize at that point is how much further back it was written than a lot of the modern fantasy and even Mistborn that we're mentioning, and Prince of Thorns, like I just said. It's I think a book that's better when you're not going into your fantasy yet with this I need epic dragons and massive scale battles and blah blah blah. It's if that's your mentality,
the threat of the world needs to be at stake from the Dark One.
Yes, if that's your expectation, Wheel of Time's another good reference there. If that's your expectation, then this can feel slow, and that was the first time I read it. It was only until I got to the point where I was I've been reading fantasy for so long and so many years that I came back and I was like, ooh, I can really appreciate this in its context, of when it, we had a bunch of conversations.
I think this can be a dicey pick for a gateway recommendation, because I think you have to kind of be open to the experience that you're about to have, right? This book is not action-packed. It's not like good versus evil. It's a lot more subtle in its delivery of its themes. It succeeds incredibly, and it's so well written. And you can see the influence that someone like Patrick Rothfuss received from this kind of work. I'd say the two works are relatively similar, but you do need a reader who's a bit more patient, I guess, or appreciative of prose over action, to get the full experience out of this book. Sometimes people read fantasy because they want the blood, the guts, the action, the politics, and you're not going to get that here. So if you know that you're not like that and you're looking for something that's just really a well-written work of fiction that will move you, and you really like some of the best character work in the genre, then yeah, it's a great rec for that. But just that caveat.
It goes back to each of these recs. You gotta think about who is this person I'm recommending it to? What do they appreciate? And are they going to be disappointed if it's not massive scale battles and blood and guts and dragons? Because there's plenty of that. Yeah, there's plenty of that you can find, and you can always default to the Mistborn has tons of action and
right.
Yeah,
right.
So it's a great series.
Great series. Can't go wrong. It's a classic. One of the ones that I wanted to recommend that's kind of more on the action-packed side, and I think would be good for people around our age, in their 30s, early 30s, and maybe they were Avatar fans at one point, The Last Airbender, which I know there's a lot of people
Not
out
the
there that love
James
that
Cameron
show.
vehicle.
No, but those are great too. But I'm talking about the animated series, with all the air bending and fire bending and all that. If that really, was something that interested you, and now you're 30 years old and you want to know what's next, well, there is the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. And I think
Oh,
that would
yeah.
be a really interesting gateway pick for somebody for a couple reasons. One, it's relatively modern. R.F. Kuang is, now she's this New York Times bestselling darling.
Number one New York
Number
Times
one, and she's kind of
bestseller.
transitioning into just like fiction literature at large, which is nice to see. But this was her first big release, right? Is the Poppy War series, and it's all this kind of elemental magic. It's an allegory for a lot of the like World War II war crimes between like China and Japan and all this other stuff. That's really, really well written, and it's a combination of R.F. Kuang's like advanced education in Asian history, and then also her command of just the fantasy genre and of fast pacing and action and blood and guts and betrayal and politics and battles and magic systems. It's a beautiful blend of the two, which fantasy does so well. Some of the greatest writers, like George Martin, was a big fantasy buff too. And, R.F. Kuang just has that different perspective that she brings a modern voice. She's a young author, too. And I just think it would be a cool thing to recommend to somebody. And then there's a lot they can dive into afterwards. But between, like, that elemental kind of style magic system and just the popularity of R.F. Kuang as an author, I think this is a pretty safe recommendation for a lot of people looking for action.
I totally agree. And I think it's a great recommendation to show newcomers that fantasy isn't just like medieval Western Europe.
Yeah,
and
embarrassing. Like, oh, the knight must protect the princess from the dark one. I'm the beautiful elf. You're like, oh, okay. Like, I love that. Don't get me wrong, but
they're always saying, "I'm the beautiful elf." Yeah.
Yes, I should be an author.
Yeah,
I am
Charles,
the
you've got the
elf.
gift.
Welcome to my land.
Yeah, but I think that sometimes people who aren't super well acquainted with the fantasy genre think that it's all Lord of the Rings or all Game of Thrones, and it's, those are two beloved series by us and many other people, but you can almost come in thinking like, oh, well, like how many times can I read about the beautiful elf and the knight saving the princess? And then if you read R.F. Kuang's Poppy War, you're like, this isn't like anything that I thought was going on in the fantasy genre. Obviously, us who are longtime readers of the fantasy genre see like there's so much awesome fantasy of diverse settings and all that kind of stuff coming from people of various backgrounds and expertise in these things like R.F. Kuang has. So it's a fantastic recommendation. I think it's also by far the number one of R.F. Kuang's catalog of books. It's by far the number one that I would recommend folks start with, because she has kind of dove into stuff that even if Babel, I believe it was number one New York Times best-selling book, I would still say that I would sooner recommend the Poppy War trilogy as an entry point, because it feels like it prioritizes like entertainment more than Babel does, and it is, I think, more accessible, action-packed, all those kind of things. If people are Babel is like it's an awesome book, and it's very focused on things like imperialism and like racism and like big picture themes revolving around that, and language as well.
Even
so if someone's like
too.
but the book's got footnotes. I mean, I don't know if my, like, hey, like, you want to read some fantasy? Like, here's your entry point. I don't know if I want them reading
It's like this
footnotes.
dude recommended a book to
Like-
me. It's got footnotes in it.
Yeah.
What is he, psychotic?
Right. It's not Mr. Miller's English class. You remember that essay, Charles? The one
Of
needed
course.
a minimum of whatever amount of footnotes. All right, this is their entry
A
point
writing
to
assignment
fantasy.
that required footnotes. You know, that's something that stuck with us 20 years later, 15 years later.
Definitely. So
But yeah,
it's a great
that's true.
entry point, Charles. It's a great recommendation. Awesome magic, historical like analogy to it, and it's very modern feeling, like modern prose, modern language that the characters don't speak in like a ye old English. Obviously, they're not like
Or
the
even like a
parallels.
Lord of the Rings style
Or,
English,
yeah.
where it's like, "My fair elven queen, your
Right.
beauty holds no equal." You know,
Or even like a Song of Ice and Fire. Like there is a sort of like old timey Western Europe feel to the way that those characters speak. Like the characters in the Poppy War, for better or worse, I enjoyed this aspect of it. Like they speak in a pretty modern
very
way. That,
plain and direct. And then when they're friendships, they're very colloquial. You know, they're the joking and
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, it's a very modern dialogue, which I do think it makes it even that much more accessible for sure.
Definitely.
What do we throw in the ring next, man?
Charles, you mentioned Avatar, and you also like there's another series, sort of Kaigen, that you
Oh, yeah.
read relatively recently. That I think people always recommend that one for fans of Avatar: The Last Airbender, not necessarily fans of James Cameron's Avatar, of which apparently Avatar 5 is due out in 2031. So set your
Any
calendars.
day now, guys. Any day now. I was a big fan of The Way of Water. I saw it in IMAX, and I was.
Oh, it was good.
entertained. It was
But
fun.
there are
Yeah.
3 more movies already planned, and Avatar 5 is due in 2031. But going back to Avatar: The Last Airbender, sort of Kaigen, a self-published indie darling and winner of one of Mark Lawrence's self-published fantasy blog-off competitions. Is that, you think? I haven't read it, Charles, but do you think that's a good entry point?
I definitely
And-
think that one. It's very sad and
Yeah.
emotional. Unlike Poppy War, which is also sad, but it's so full of action that it just hits
Well,
different.
It's famous for the bucket of tears, which you and I
but
think
it-
is a little
it
overblown.
hits
but-
different. Like sort of Kaigen's very much like a story about a mother and being in a patriarchal family and the relationship she's trying to have with her sons during wartime, and the other one is kick-ass lady kills a lot of people with crazy powers. There's a big difference there. Both are very emotional for sure, but one is much more introspective and dramatic. And that is the sword of Kaigen, and that magic system is way
By
more
M.L.
related.
Wong, which I forgot to say. That's
Yes,
the author.
and that is more elemental magic, like Poppy War. It's elemental too, but they also can it's more like X-Men powers, where everyone gets something different, and it could always be something, like they could turn into stuff, or they can manipulate fire, or there's all kinds of different magic. But in sort of Kaigen, families control elements, and then they're at war. I would say, I would probably recommend it if someone is a really avid fiction reader and maybe they want to support the indie genre. I mean, now the book is traditionally published, not quite the same, but it was at one point independently published. I think that's a great way to go. And for Avatar fans, that's another good option too, because that one is more directly like elemental control to fight. But if you're expecting tons of action, there are great fight scenes in it, but it's ultimately a drama. So it's a little bit of a distinction there, which could be, a selling point for you. So something to consider.
For sure.
While we're
And I
talking
think-
about go ahead. I was going
Well-
to transition, but do
Well,
that.
maybe I'll transition to the same place that you were going there, Charles, because I think something of value in this is to show how good books that come from a self-published background can be And I think that some folks who aren't as involved in the fantasy community as you or I or many of our listeners, I'm sure, they might not realize how much high quality self-published fantasy is out there. So I think that reading this can open up a whole new like Pandora's box, but a good Pandora's box, Charles. Great metaphor there. Yeah, it can open up a whole new world of books that folks might not have considered otherwise if they're just getting into the genre. They're like, wait, this started out self-published? Like, what other amazing self-published books are there out there?
Kind of like how James Cameron opened the world to the brand new world of Pandora when Avatar came back in the
Maybe that's why I went toward the Pandora's box analogy.
Box.
You think it was just like in my head?
Maybe so. Maybe so. You got incepted by James Cameron.
I know. You never want to get incepted by James Cameron. Like,
Not if you can avoid it.
Yeah. If you're gonna get incepted, you'd rather be by Christopher Nolan. Like that's
yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio, incept away, my friend. James Cameron,
but not James Cameron.
So you guys got enough ideas. I don't need him trying to come into mine, you know.
But
so I noticed that
Charles,
we're kind of. Go ahead, finish your thought, and then I was going to
we're
suggest a rapid
struggling
fire.
here. The chemistry. Oh,
Just so excited! So many good books
rapid
to talk
fire. All right.
About. Well, we're about 40 minutes in.
Can we get a couple non-rapid fire, maybe medium fire?
A couple medium fire,
medium-paced fire here. One that I just want to make sure gets the attention that it deserves because it holds a special place in my heart is The Red Wolf Conspiracy, the first book of the Chatham Voyage Quartet by Robert V.S. Reddick, friend of the show. We did a whole read-along of this series, and it is with Robert and also with Blaze from Under the Radar Books. And we talked to Robert after each book, and it was absolutely awesome and an honor because this book
a treasure,
was... Yeah, I always view this book as being, or this series at large, as being what hooked me into the fantasy genre and made the difference between, like, oh, I just really like A Song of Ice and Fire, to, all right, now I know I'm a big fan of the fantasy genre and I want to try more. This book is an absolutely captivating and imaginative story about a group of characters who are on this giant ship and get kind of embroiled in this world-changing, potential world-ending level events, and are also just kind of like getting to know each other and developing relationships and all those kind of things. It's got like all these magic creatures and monsters and characters. Like there's a talking rat. I mean, there's characters that are representing all sorts of like wacky, imaginative things.
The imaginative adventure aspect of it is so off the charts. The creativity of it, the originality of it. If you're someone who's just looking to dive into like an adventure fantasy story, that's a good one for sure.
Yeah, it's got a pretty vast world building to it. So you want someone who's ready to really dive into that. But I don't know. This series was one that I just could not stop reading when I picked it up. It was one of those like I was on some sort of like break from school or something, and I just remember like for a week or more, I was just like, wake up, like read the book, like eat breakfast while I read the book, like just straight through the day. I would like finish the books in like a couple days, and
it's such a great experience to have, just being hooked by a book like that.
Yeah,
for sure. So I mean, that alone, glowing endorsement. And I think we're ready to. Is there more medium fire stuff you want to get to before we enter the rapid fire?
Depending how rapid. Let's see how rapid the rapid fire is, but
sure.
I'll just say check out our Catherine Voyage episode with Robert Fitzgerald from before we got into the series, and you can hear a lot more about the series. Cause
we do have like a spoiler-free kickoff episode where you can get to know Robert and the story a little bit in a spoiler-free way before we start reading. So
yeah, I just love that series so much, and the more people I can get to hop on board, the
FTF series was great too. We should do more of those. I don't know. Like, we did the one, and then that was it. We should pick another.
Just us being lazy
to go on that journey with us, Yeah. But before then, okay, I'll do one really fast, and I think you'll have no problems going fast with this one. Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is great for a lot of reasons. It's short. So always great to recommend. The prose is off the charts. It's much more of a classic fantasy story that could easily get you into other like coming of age, dragons, swords, sorcery, magic stories. And Dylan, you actually had an experience where you recommended this as a gateway fantasy story to someone, and it went over quite well. Isn't that correct?
Oh, yeah, Charles. That is definitely correct. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's... sorry, I'm just... Wizard of Earthsea was the book that I recommended to my grandma, if that's what you're... Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. And she liked it,
I was trying to think... Oh, my grandma...
She's not an avid fantasy reader.
No, I guess it worked extremely well. I was just trying to think if that was what you were referring to. Okay. Was. Yeah, no, my grandma absolutely
And I actually helped you suggest that one too, because you were like, hey, my grandma wants to
that's true.
Read a fantasy story. What should she read? And I was the one who suggested Wizard of Earthsea, and you were like, perfect. That's actually a really good rec. And
it's a great
The rest is history.
Fantastic prose, just absolutely timeless. Works for every age. I mean, this book from my soon-to-be 90-year-old grandma.
Wow. Love that.
She is, we got the big party coming up. I'm going down to Florida for that one. So excited for that.
That is big.
Yeah. And, it was basically one of the reasons that like the young adult genre even came to exist, in my understanding. So it's like it's got this. It's a Bildungsroman, Charles. So it's got this.
The young adult genre wasn't a category of story when this book came out. It didn't exist.
Yeah, but it's got this appeal that I think would work from like teenage to my soon-to-be 90-year-old grandma. And it's absolutely timeless. It's amazing that it was written. I mean, let me find what year it was written there, Charles. But it was written in 1968.
Nice. That is classic. I mean, that's like a stone throw away from when like Lord of the Rings was
Lord of the Rings
out, was like a modern story at the time.
And I gotta say,
like the 50s. So.
I gotta say, it reads so much more like modern and timeless than Lord of the Rings. I gotta say it, Charles.
It does. I mean, they're two totally different styles, but Ursula's is fantastic, and lots of like spiritual symbolism and stuff like that. It's not a spiritual book necessarily, but there is a lot of really great symbolism to dive into in that story.
It draws from a lot of like the concept of the Tao, I believe it is, like Taoist sort of beliefs. It is a lot of it about like being one with nature and the world around you, and what does that mean, and what does it mean to like mess with nature and mess with the way of things. It's got so much wisdom to offer in that realm, and it's also just a fantastic, almost like campfire style storytelling of stuff that can seem pretty familiar to fantasy readers, like a relatively young character attending a magic academy. But keep in mind that this very much far predates like Harry Potter and all those kind of things. So
Yeah,
this
I
is
mean, think
trope
about it. It's like
starter.
30 years though, because Harry Potter was it was late 90s, and this was late
Yeah.
60s. So, yeah, very, very interesting. And that's Wizard of Earthsea for you. Not so much a rapid fire on that one, but how about this? I'm gonna try
No.
another rapid fire. See if we can do it. I would say for people who are into like young adults books in general, and now they're trying to ready for, you know, they're adults now and they want to read, you know, the next thing. I think The Final Strife is a great recommendation.
Oh yeah.
Because
Sarah Larifi.
it reads kind of like a Hunger Games, but it's really
Mm.
much more mature than that, and it's a much, you know, Sara El-Arifi's got a fantastic voice. She takes her characters to unique settings, and she built this whole magic system, class system. The first book is all around a tournament, and there's politics involved in it, and the characters are super, super interesting and unique as well. So I think if anyone's looking for some of that new adult, but with some edge and some also like social commentary as well, definitely check out The Final Strife. And Sarah El-Arifi is one of those relatively new voices in the genre. It's been over a year now since she came on to talk about The Final Strife, and she's already has the second book out, and she's got another series going. She's an absolute machine, someone to look out for. So that's a great book to give to someone as a gift too, because you could probably still get the hardcover. It's a fresh voice in the genre, and so recommend.
Well said, Charles. Definitely second that one. All right, let's throw another modern author out there, one who's been cranking out books for a while now and produced the massively popular A Court of Thorns and Roses series. That's Sarah J.
Oh,
Maas. And we covered that relatively recently. So this is like romantic fantasy, and I would say that it kind of fits in the new adult category, which is a little older than young adult, but it's kind of been like things at the forefront of that romantic fantasy new adult subgenre. And I mean, it has been a crossover hit, this series. You see people reading it all over the place, and it's one of those, like, it has almost 2 million ratings or something like that on Goodreads. It's like 2 million people, can't be wrong type of things. Like, this
yeah,
book is one of those that's like not just getting people into fantasy in general, but also getting people just broadly, like getting people into reading. So
for
I think
sure.
this is a it's one where you have to kind of gauge the person. Like, are you trying to, are they a romance reader and you're trying to
Yeah,
get them to bridge the gap into fantasy, like romantic fantasy, and then further from there, if you want to try to get them hooked on something that's like more epic fantasy, this is kind of a good in between there. Or maybe they'll
oh
just
yeah,
find that they love this book and the next one they're going to read is Fourth Wing, which is kind of another new adult
yeah,
fantasy romance type thing. So it's like
yeah,
I consider it all, like, we read much more like epic fantasy, grimdark fantasy, all that kind of stuff on here, but you know, romantic fantasy is just as legitimate a part of the
yes,
fantasy genre. It's just a different
yes,
subgenre that we don't cover as much. But if you get them
yes.
into that, it counts. It counts.
It counts for sure. Great gateway rec. This is one where like coworkers, friends, family, like in IRL, coming out to talk about this book and
IRL,
recommend it,
Charles.
and get into it. So people who aren't like friends that I nerd out about fantasy stuff over, we can still connect over A Court of Thorns and Roses, you know. So that's a really great recommendation for sure. Just so popular and so accessible. How could you not? Another one worth recommending that we kind of talked about in the pre-show, when we were just chatting, Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. I actually gifted this to a friend of mine for the holidays last year. Not an avid fantasy reader, but a reader, and you know, just a fun book. Fantastic, spectacular cursing in this one, like next level swears and stuff like that. Really interesting setting along the grimdark genre, so highly recommended for that. Just some really charismatic prose and characters that, you know, for anyone who think might like the grimdark genre, is looking for something that's just kind of fun and entertaining, that The Lies of Locke can not be missed. Book 1 of the Gentleman Bastard sequence.
Definitely, for any fans of rogues out there, this is a can't miss. And another book I'll throw out there that at Andres Freire said on Twitter that I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely one that I should include. The Six of Crows duology, which just relatively
also on
recently,
Netflix.
the last few years, was made into a Netflix series, and it's kind of a young adult version of something like The Lies of Locke. Obviously, that's a very bird's eye view parallel. They're different books, but it has lots of rogues and a heist and all that kind of stuff going on in it. And maybe you can get folks who are watching the series on Netflix, or at least like the idea that there is an adaptation. Maybe you can get them on board, and it's also written in a really accessible, entertaining way, which, as you've probably seen from the way we're talking about this, is a super important part in the way that we see these gateway books.
For sure. That's a great place to start. That's certainly a lot of books for people to take notes on. Are there any others on the socials that we want to give a shout out to before we wrap it up?
Let me see. Oh, yeah. So let me just find the person who said this. Yes. At Tory Talks 2 mentioned the Rhaenyra. Yeah, the Rhaenyra Revelations by Michael Sullivan.
About this right before we recorded. This would have been a shame if we missed.
Yes, definitely would have been a shame. I would say this is just a extremely entertaining. Another series that was initially self-published, then later became traditionally published. Michael Sullivan's Rhaenyra Revelations. They're set in kind of a typical like high fantasy type world. It does fit into the Western medieval fantasy type feel to it, but it also feels like a super modern version of that in the way that the characters interact and talk. And it is extremely entertaining. It's witty, it's fun. It's got a duo in Royce and Hadrian, the main characters, who are, whenever you ask people like, oh, who are the best duos in fantasy, you're gonna get those two coming up. It's a bit of like an odd couple sort of pairing, not a romantic couple, but
the odd couple weren't romantic.
no, but I'm just hearing myself say, I'm like, do people know the odd couple? Like, what am I talking about?
That's a good question. I mean, I knew what you were talking about.
I was like, why do I know what I'm talking about? Why do I know about the odd couple? Either way,
to be young enough to not know that reference.
Charles is a little older than me, for those of you wondering.
Yeah, like a year.
Yeah.
The Odd Couple had been out for quite a while before then. Okay?
That year makes a difference when it comes to understanding Odd Couple references.
Clearly it doesn't, because you know just as much as me. You made the reference, not me.
That's true.
So that's on you. But yes.
Wait.
What we're talking about, Rhaenyra Revelations, great book,
Revelations,
great, sword, sorcery, rogue, duo, banter story. Recommend.
Okay. So I'm gonna say one by rapid fire, I guess, just based on length of episode, but one by me, and I'll get back to a couple more from the Twitter users. Red Sister by Mark Lawrence would be a great recommendation, I think. Mark Lawrence, just an awesome author with a very diverse catalog, many of which could be entry points. I think Prince of Thorns is just more grimdark and grittier and that kind of stuff, more blood and guts. So if someone seems super into that idea, then it could be a fantastic gateway. But I think Red Sister, which has some of that, definitely has action, has fun friendships, has romance, has everything, magic, all that kind of stuff, and a great premise with like great like battle
warrior,
nuns, basically warrior nuns, and like with also still having kind of the magic school element to it. I just think that that's one that if I didn't know a ton about a person, but they're like, "Oh, I get into fantasy," I'd be pretty quick to just be like, "Yeah, check that out." And
I've
Mark
gifted
Lawrence is so
Mark
much
Lawrence before to people who I've tried to convert from the sci-fi genre because
Oh
he
yeah,
kind of walks that line of like science fiction influence in his settings and in some of the premise of his like world building, but it's at its core a fantasy story. So when I have, friends who I know are big sci-fi readers, I'll get them like the Empire of Thorns. Is that the name of the trilogy? What's the name of the trilogy? The
the
Prince of
name of the
Thorns?
trilogy is The Broken Empire.
Broken Empire. Yes, yes, yes. So I would gift like a Broken Empire box set. I'm like, hey, you might like this, Mr. Science Fiction fan, because there's some really interesting sci-fi connections here that you may want to check out. So yeah, and then all of his books to me have some of that because he is a man of science. He is a man of space and math, and that comes across in a lot of his.
He was a
a lot
rocket
of his work.
scientist before.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So, and great guy. We've had him on the show. He's been a fantastic supporter of the show. So, also, at Chris Horn 22 mentioned Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. That's the right way to say his name, right?
Yep.
Neil Gaiman. I feel like I'm messing that up. So, Charles, you've read a bunch of Neil Gaiman. I recently read The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I thought that would be a really great entry point for people. It's short, it's captivating, it is I don't know, Gaiman just has this way, this aesthetic that he can set that I think is extremely, I don't know how to describe it, it's extremely unique and just puts you in a certain mindset that I can't think of any other writer that can do. It's like very sort of mysterious and magical the way that the ocean at the end of the lane plays out. Haven't read Neverwhere, but Charles, thoughts on any Gaiman entry points you've read?
I've read Sandman, several volumes of Sandman, the graphic novel. I've read Coraline, which is a young adult story that's excellent. I read American Gods. I think he's a good read for people who are into some maybe gothic or horror influences. He kind of taps into that. I don't know. He's got like this ambiance the way he writes.
Yeah.
He like sets a vibe that so few authors can do. I don't know how he quite does it, but it's not quite surreal. It's not quite gothic. It's very much Neil Gaiman, but he just achieves this atmosphere, and it's a really interesting, unique experience to have as a reader to take on one of his books. So I think it would be great for someone who's like, oh, I love Stephen King, or I love Nightmare Before Christmas or something, or it's like, hey, check out one of these Neil Gaiman books. He might do it for you. It's a great way.
Or if they love Coraline, because you can actually be like, if someone's watched those adaptations, like American Gods also been adapted, you do have the entry point of just being like, hey, this movie, like, it's written by the guy that originally wrote Coraline.
Good Omens, he half wrote that with Terry
Omens.
Pratchett. That's on Amazon.
Yeah. So you have a bit of an easy way to get people into it by referencing some other work, which I think is key. So, Charles, we've got Fantasy Files podcast, That Files Fantasy, one of the ones. Great. Yeah, so we've got two mentioned here that I think are definitely worth discussing. One is The Way of Shadows, the Night Angel trilogy. Oh, yeah. You've read that.
Falls into the same kind of category as Mistborn does, but it's a bit more on the grimdark side. There's a lot more violence and blood and guts in Brent Weeks' story, but the same like hard magic system, cloak and dagger kind of combat, ensemble of characters, politics. So it's a great recommendation.
Yeah. And then we've got Stormfront, which is Dresden Files #1, Charles. So you and I have both read Dresden Files #1. I've also read the second book. It's I'll be honest, with the chance of getting flamed for this one.
Oh boy.
The first book in the Dresden Files series just it did not do it that well for me. I didn't think it was bad. I guess it was just one of those like this feels like a really hyped book that just for me, I don't know. There's something that couldn't quite draw me in at the same level that other people seem to be drawn into this. I've heard some folks say like, "Oh, you gotta like give it a few books and all that kind of stuff." So one day I'm gonna get back to it. One day we're gonna cover this for the show for sure, and maybe my thoughts will change. But that's kind of what I took away from it. But all that being said, I do see it as something that could be a great entry point for folks, especially if they like mystery genre, but are looking for something that'll have a little more supernatural element to it. It is funny and entertaining and accessible, and there's a lot out there, and they're relatively short compared to a lot of other fantasy out there. So I definitely see it.
Right. It's
If
got a
it
sense
were
of
my
humor.
entry point, yeah. I don't think it would work as well as like Chatham Voyage worked for me, but there's also plenty of people that Chatham Voyage wouldn't work for as well as Dresden does. So yeah, that's kind
Dresden
of where
has
I'm
a
at with it.
very dedicated fan base and all that, so there is,
A chance of me
huge,
getting flamed
huge
online,
market
yes.
for it. Yes, a huge-
It's one of
Yes.
those books I'm like, oh, this one. Like most of the time, you don't get flamed. At least on our podcast, we occasionally it'll happen, but for the most part, you don't. You can say you didn't really love a book. Dresden is one of those I'm like, uh-oh. Like, there's a chance here.
At least you waited till an hour in, so hopefully
Yeah,
most of them
exactly.
have given up by now. But you never know.
Like, they haven't even mentioned Dresden. I'm dropping out.
Yeah, no Dresden in the first 10 minutes. I'm out of here. I don't even know if we got to any books in the first 10 minutes, but we tried. Hey, one we said we were going to mention and almost didn't is The Rage of Dragons by
Oh,
Evan
yes.
Winter. This
Let
is
me
a
find the
great
person
one.
that brought that to our attention.
Yes, find the
too, because
person,
they
and so we
deserve
can give them a
credit.
shout out, because that was one of the ones when we were looking at the social media recs earlier. We're like, ooh, yeah, it's a great one, especially for like, and I know this is Gateway, so Game of Thrones is already in the mix, but especially like a Game of Thrones kind of fan is going to love this one. It's kind of like Game of Thrones meets the Upside Down and Stranger Things. You know, it's like like the kind of connection meets like Gladiator.
Yes, definitely
So,
get Gladiator in there.
Yeah. Did we find the rec on the social?
Yeah, so two people did. Psyched Michael, and that they said Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, if we didn't say it. And
Oh, did
also,
I not say by Evan Winter? That's
I don't
bad.
know. Maybe you did. I don't know. But we also had. This is gonna be a tough one. Their name is not appearing in my screenshot, but they did have a great comment, and I'll find the name in a second, because they also recommended The Poppy War. They also recommended Realm of Elderlings.
Okay, so they've got a style here.
Yes. We also, so they also said Rage of Dragons, of course, as I was saying, and they said Jade City by Fonda Lee, which we read relatively recently. I could see that as a fantastic entry point, Charles. What do you think?
Yeah, I could see that because it's got a more modern setting. It's based on like organized crime, which who doesn't love a good organized crime story? And the the magic system lends itself well to fun action scenes. And it's two warring mob families in like this like California meets Japan kind of vibe. And it's really cool and interesting. So I think that's a great read. And that's another one that kind of focuses on the reading experience and entertainment while also delivering just like really interesting story, themes, characters, all of that too is there. Sometimes you can't always get both, but you do in that story. And that's what makes Fonda Lee so great and popular.
Yes. And that was from @EnerJameEZ, I believe is the way to pronounce that. Apologies if I didn't get that right. Oh, is it just Ener James? Ener James? there's some capitalization stuff going on here, so I apologize if I'm not interpreting it correctly. But let's say Enter James is the person that said those recommendations, all of which are great. So yeah, Charles, that's there's plenty of other comments, and this is one that we got enough feedback that even before we started the episode, I was already like, I feel bad that that we're gonna record this episode and we can't we can't discuss like 98% of the books that were recommended here, because
and I mean, you guys are awesome for that. Like, thank you all for coming on and giving your recommendations. They were super helpful in preparing for the episode. It's just fun to talk like on social about some of these gateway books, you know, because some of these we've talked about on the show like years ago now at this point, and it's good to kind of come back to them and talk about them again. So yeah, this is just a lot of fun, and hopefully you listeners at home taking a lot of notes, got some ideas on what to read next. I don't know how many books we talked about today, but dozens, it's gotta be. Definitely something in there. If you haven't read it, you should definitely give it a shot, because lots of really interesting stuff there. And hey, if you want to ever recommend fantasy books, gateway or not, you know where to find us over on the socials. We always love to chat, so don't hesitate to reach out. But until then, Dylan, are we good on the Rex? Are there any others you need to give a shout out to before we played that sweet, sweet outro music?
Fantasy book nerd, I see you out there. FBN.
We see you, FBN.
Right. Although I love FBN, so I'm shouting them out. But
you're gonna shout out also, what they recommended? Or?
No, just no. I just like them. The problem is, I told FBN this. They recommend a bunch of books that I've not read, so I can't speak to that well. But among which is David Gemmell, which is like David Gemmel's like a legend that unfortunately I haven't read anything by, so I do want to throw that out there. And you know what, Charles? We've got the Yorkshire Book Collector out there saying The Faithful and the Fallen as their entry point by John Gwynne. So I thought we should at least throw out
Papa
we
Gwynne.
love John Gwynne, Papa Gwynne. And we should at least say, like, Shadow of the Gods, I think, could be a fantastic entry point. Such amazing cinematic fights going on in that one. So it's like people who are used to more visual content, if they're transitioning toward reading stuff, this will just like create that awesome vivid image in their head.
That Norse inspired mythology too, and setting, if you like shield walls and fjords and Yorgs and Bjorgs. It's all in there.
If you love Yorgs, you should check out Prince of Thorns.
There's lots of Yorgs in there too, for sure. Yeah. Oh, just one.
At least one.
Kind of important character. So yeah, that's a great rec. He's like a reenactor too, so you could tell he knows what he's talking about. He's describing things like putting on a helmet while wearing armor and fumbling with the strap and trying to adjust your shield to make a shield wall and all these really interesting details. And he combines like creature magic too. He's got like giant dragons and giant wolves and bears and all these other cool creatures that you can appreciate, especially like Witcher fans, God of War fans, those kinds of stories and vibes. He's definitely delivering on that experience for sure. Shout out to Papa Gwynne and the brothers Gwynne.
Definitely. That's at @book_Yorkshire. Thank you for that, and thank all of you who contributed. I'm sorry to anyone that we weren't able to get to your comments, but we appreciate them. We always love engaging in the dialogue with you all on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter. They appear to have gone to just this symbol, but I'm not going to say what letter that symbol represents, because you know what? I'm Team Twitter. I'm it's like that Leonardo DiCaprio in in Wolf of Wall Street, saying things I can't say on our clean podcast, but he's like, I'm not effing leaving. That's me on Twitter. Like, I'm not
I've never
leaving. I'm
seen
not
that
going
movie.
over to. You haven't?
No, I've never seen Wolf of Wall Street. I don't know why. I'm not like protesting it or anything. I just haven't seen it.
Stop protesting it, Charles. Go see it. At least get it in before Avatar 4, which is due in 2029.
You know what? I'll go. I'll do my best on that one.
Avatar 3, if you get to that before Wolf of Wall Street, that's all right. But if I see you wearing some 3D glasses, some futuristic 3D glasses, going to Avatar 4 before you've even seen Wolf of Wall Street, all right, there's going to be hell to pay.
Bro, James Cameron's transported me, man. Like, what can I say?
Yeah.
Who directed Wolf of Wall Street? Was it Scorsese? Like,
that sounds right.
what has he done for me lately? Doesn't he have a movie in theaters now, actually? Like, as I'm saying this.
Does he?
Some 4-hour long thing with Robert De Niro.
Oh, is it like Killers of the Flower Moon?
Yeah.
That's Scorsese?
Yes.
I haven't been paying any attention to it. I like see that
Scorsese.
exists.
It exists. It does. I have no idea how long it is, but I mean, you know, how could you not watch it? It's Scorsese, but anyway, let's go ahead and play that sweet outro music now. What do you say?
Let's get that sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right. Thank you all so much, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, a great way to do that is over on the socials, giving us a like and reaching out to us over there. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than engaging with us over on social media, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify. Just 2 clicks at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and helps us so much when you do that. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts, and yeah, that means you can write nice things about us in a beautiful 5-star review. And if you do that, it'll put a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Just listening, guys. More than enough. Greatly appreciated. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.